Today is the second part of a pulpit exchange with Glen Acres Baptist Church, all happening virtually online. We were pleased that Bill Horn from Glen Acres could speak at both churches a month ago, and it is my privilege to speak to the folks at Glen Acres and Highland today. Every summer I have preached a biographical sermon, something I hoped would be light and easy for a summer Sunday, and I chose Leo Tolstoy. After all, as a child, I read his book of short stories, and they were so charming. Some of you will remember the touching story of Martin the Cobbler, which is often read at Christmas. And if you don't know it, you will have to look it up, surely. But the challenge of Tolstoy's life and message are anything but light and easy. They lead us to ask some vital questions. How do you read the Bible and decide what is important? How do we manage our wealth as a privileged people? How do you respond to injustice reflected in some of the issues of our time? Occupy Wall Street, idle no more, missing and murdered indigenous women, the neglect of treaties, Black Lives Matter. Let us see what we can learn from Tolstoy. He was born over 150 years ago, about 200 kilometers south of Moscow, on a vast country estate, the Yasnaya Polyana. He was born in an age of turmoil, like ours. Not much earlier, the French Revolution had taken the lives of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. And in the remote steppes of Russia, trouble was brewing. The peasants felt that their lives should be better. Marxism was stirring. Lenin was gathering a following. The Bolshevik Revolution would soon be underway. As a young person, there was nothing exemplary about Tolstoy. In fact, we might roll our eyes at some of his activities. He drank too much and partied and caroused with women. He flunked out of university and on impulse joined the army to fight in Crimea, which claimed 600,000 lives. Huge. Tolstoy was an officer stationed at Sevastopol and sent letters or dispatches from the front to his home and to his local newspaper, and there began his writing career. Ultimately, the Russians were defeated, and Tolstoy sped away to Paris. But Paris was no picnic. It was still a hotbed of rebellion and revenge on the part of local people, the hoi polloi, who had suffered so many hardships. He watched with curious horror as lines of upper-class people were led mercilessly to the guillotine. He drank and gambled until he was flat broke, and in his mid-30s, he finally trudged home to lay claim to his vast inheritance and estate. He wrote in his book, Confession, "I put men to death in war. I fought duels to slay others. I lost at cards, rioted with loose women, and deceived men. Drunkenness, violence, and murder, all were committed by me. Such was my life for 10 years. Back at home, he met his match in Sonia, a beautiful and strong-willed daughter of a local doctor. They fell in love and were married very quickly. He was 35 and she was 18. They were fiercely devoted to each other, but their relationship was stormy from day one to the end. And some of that is captured in the brilliant movie, The Last Station, with Helen Mirren and Christopher Plummer.
I I've never stopped loving you. But God knows you don't make it easy.
Be easy. I am the work of your life. You are the work of mine. That's what love is.
Many years after he had died, Sonia was in a quiet place and in a wistful mood when a daughter asked her, "What are you thinking about?" "I'm thinking about him. I'm always thinking about him." In the early years of their marriage, he wrote the massive 1,200-page book, War and Peace. He would write during the day, and Sonia would laboriously, faithfully rewrite each page during the night for each of his 3 to 4 rewrites. The book alone consumed 10 years of their lives. His next book, Anna Karenina, swallowed up another decade. It begins with these famous lines: "All happy families resemble each other. Each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way." There are so many ways for dysfunction, aren't there? He was in his 50s when he wrote his next book, The Death of Ivan Ilyich, and it tells the story of a well-to-do Russian judge who is content to meet the expectations of his family and values his orderly, domestic, and official routine. He's helping his family hang up some curtains in their home when he has a fall and has a minor injury. But the doctor discovers something far more sinister. He's dying. He has a cancer, perhaps of the gallbladder or of the pancreas. For most of the family and his colleagues, his death is an inconvenience, he figures, and they're relieved not to be dying themselves. And this well-to-do man comes to the jarring realization that he has wasted his life on trivial things, and he has lived and died and has nothing to show for it. That was the very question Tolstoy was asking himself. If I die, what will become of my life? Will I be filled with regrets or satisfaction? And those are the questions we all can ask. Will you be happy with how you have lived? Somewhere along the way at this later stage of life, Tolstoy encountered Jesus Christ. And typical of those who come to Christ later in life, not by dint of tradition or by birth, he took his faith with intense and unwavering seriousness. The church did not help him, but back on his estate, he observed that most of the peasants lived happy and satisfied lives. They did not have much theology or philosophy. They simply loved Jesus and sought to walk in his way. He began to read the Bible with fresh passion, and he came to the conclusion that the Gospels, which tell the story of Jesus, were at the heart of the Bible and the most important part of the Bible. And the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus taught, were at the center and core of the Gospels. He was completely devoted to Jesus Christ. And of course that, my friends, is a dangerous thing and can change your life. He decided he must care for the poor and the needy and the least around him. He began to teach the children of peasants and servants to read and write, and give them a chance to rise above poverty. In those days, only nobles and the very rich were offered an education. In daring to teach the poor, he was labeled an anarchist and viewed with suspicion by the Tsar and the church, which was committed to the Tsar. They were both more concerned with status and power than the care of the poor. Not surprisingly, in the Russia that followed the Tsars, the church too was outlawed. And this can be a serious lesson to today's church in North America, to be careful about political alignments. Political fortunes can change, and the church can find itself out on a limb. The nobles, the Tsar, the church, the wealthy, and the vast landowners were all about grabbing more wealth and power. And Tolstoy wrote a short story which you can easily understand, and is as relevant today as when it was written. Its evocative title, How Much Land Does a Man Need? And it's about a successful farmer who has secured a good life for himself, even though he was working on leased land. And he thought to himself, if only he were an owner, his profits would soar, and he would have a very comfortable life. He'd heard of the Bashkirs from Turkey, supposedly simple-minded people who practically gave land away. And he went to their community and arrived at a very profitable understanding. For 1,000 rubles, he could own all the land he could encircle on foot in one day, from sunrise to sunset. But if he failed to return in time, he would forfeit the money. He thought it was a wonderful offer. With the rise of the sun, he set out cheerfully, already planning how he would use the land. He wisely paces himself, knowing he must plan for enough time to return to the starting point before sundown. He goes around a meadow and a furrowed field, a babbling brook and a dappled pasture. He quickly circles round them and realizes he has traveled far. He had better hurry back, but he had given himself ample time. He strides across the far side of a meadow and the many acres that would soon be his. He sees the sun is setting and he runs up the hill and he makes it just in time. The Bashkirs are true to their word. They applaud his effort and good fortune as he reaches out to grasp the deed for all the lands that would be his. He collapses from the exertion of his very full day and is dead at their feet. They don't know what to do except to dig a hole 6 feet long in which to place his body. And this short story ends with the title of the story, How Much Land Does a Man Need? It challenges the greed of every age. Tolstoy understood. He could not live the Sermon on the Mount but for God's grace, nor could he enter God's heaven but for God's gift of salvation in Jesus Christ. But he did not take lightly our responsibility to live in Christ-like ways, that each of us must grapple with what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ. But how far do you go? What struck panic into the heart of his family was a serious commitment to these words in Matthew. If anyone wants your coat, give him your cloak as well. Much to the chagrin of his family, he began to give away tracts of land to the desperately poor. Is that how we are supposed to live? I will come back to that in a moment. Peace was another major theme of his life. At the age of 65, he wrote about the kingdom of God. His teachings drew heavily on the Beatitudes. Blessed are the peacemakers. And verse 39 of our text. Do not offer violent resistance to the one who does evil. Tolstoy became totally committed to peaceful approaches to reform. The impact of his teaching would be felt around the world, and even today. A young Indian lawyer by the name of Gandhi read his book and began an exchange of letters with Tolstoy. And Gandhi opted for peaceful ways to seek independence for India. Gandhi, in turn, inspired a young Martin Luther King Jr., who led peaceful protests in the 60s. And beside him was a young John Lewis, the civil rights icon, as he is known today, who died about a month ago. And Lewis said of the demonstrations and violence and riots of this summer, "I know your pain, your rage, your sense of despair and hopelessness. Justice has indeed been denied for far too long. Rioting, looting, and burning, however, is not the way. Organize, demonstrate, sit in, stand up, vote. Be constructive, not destructive." Passions run hot when there is injustice. And some people don't know what to do with their rage. Their behavior is like the man who has a fight with his wife and begins to smash the china and throw it across the room, or put his hand through the wall. It is unhelpful, unproductive, and destructive. Indeed, it is totally counterproductive. And in the larger context of society and nations, violence only begets violence. Tolstoy's way and the way of Christ is the way of peace. At the age of 80, Tolstoy left home. Perhaps he had had a lover's quarrel with his wife. At least that is how it is depicted in the movie. You can watch a short clip.
If I can't work and find some peace, then I shall go away. They have a
Powerful little piece, isn't it? He took a train to who knows where for some peace and quiet, but along the way he contracted pneumonia and spent his last days in a remote train station. Thankfully, word got back to Sonia, and she was by his side when he died. And this great literary figure, a moral luminary and disciple of Christ, was gone. What do you take away from his life and teachings? What about wealth and our earthly treasures? We know we cannot take them away with us in our final journey. And we do have to plan for tomorrow and live wisely. And perhaps some of us may wish to leave a meaningful legacy. Here are some thoughts, some takeaways from the whole context of Tolstoy and his life. First this, live generously. When I go out for walks, quite often with Angela, my wife, I sometimes wear a t-shirt with a message printed on the front. And at times there are people who peer at this t-shirt, wondering if it is saying something extremist and dangerous. I suppose it is radical and extreme. It says this: live generously now. It's a good way to live. And secondly, this: he was passionate about peace. It is a biblical concept. The Beatitudes say, "Blessed are the peacemakers." Be an ally for justice and peace, caring for the desperately poor. It is one way to be a peacemaker. And finally this: there are many ways to live, many appealing options. The best and truest way is to live in a way that is passionate about Jesus Christ, to love Him and follow Him, and let Him be your friend and model and master. There is no better way to live.